Hello everyone. I will give a few minutes for everybody to join. I'm excited to have the opportunity to share with you guys today. What I'm going to be talking about is the effects of both the coronavirus, the quarantine, and of the moment in which we find ourselves, specifically referencing the time period after the murder of George Floyd, on the mental health of minorities. I'm grateful for the opportunity to share today with you guys. Thankful to my NAMI Greater Houston brothers and sisters. I'm blessed to serve and to be a part of it. And to my sister Jessica McDonald for her heart, for her desire to push the conversation forward and allowing people an opportunity to share our hearts on the topic as it relates to mental health, specifically relating to minorities. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes for people to jump on. I know this sends out an alert to let everybody know that people are on. As you come in, if you don't mind commenting and let me know where you're tuning in from, I'd love to interact with you. This is not a monologue, so while I'm excited to be able to share with you, I would love for it to be a dialogue, a conversation that we're able to have back and forth. If you guys have any questions, I'd love to answer those. But I'm excited to be with you and to be able to share. Thank you for all of the likes and shares and the comments on the posts that I've done so far today. I had one really special one that I wanted to do earlier, and then it started pouring down raining, something I was going to do outside earlier today, but I've got something that I want to end the day with after this later today. That's special that I want to share with you guys as well. So as you're coming in, comment where you tuning in from, who are you? I'd love to interact with you here. And share this on your pages so that those connected to you can see and participate in the conversation as well. To anybody that does not know, my name's Bishop Billy Dorsey Jr. I have been connected to NAMI now going on 7 years. I'm 6 years plus now. I first got connected to NAMI through my friend and brother Derek De La Pena, who is a mentor and somebody that I love dearly. We both were serving in the men's ministry at Lakewood Church at the time. He was one of the leaders and I was new to the church. And he heard my story of overcoming homelessness and mental health challenges with depression and suicidal thoughts while I was homeless to become successful in the music industry and in ministry. And Derek mentioned, hey, I'm going to be doing this walk for this organization called NAMI. And we're putting together a team and you should come and be a part because your story dovetails nicely with what NAMI does. And out of my trust and respect for him, I came and was a part of that first NAMI walk that I was blessed to be a part of. And I met people like Mari Ledergerber, who has become a surrogate mother to me, someone, she and Jaime and her son Jaime Andrew, that I love dearly, and my wife and my kids love dearly. And through Mari and Derek and some of the other people, Kathy and Rachel Bromley and some of the people that were a part of NAMI at the time that I came on board, I was ushered into the NAMI family. And in the years since, I've gone from being just somebody who was blessed to be a part of the walks and singing the anthem and doing those things to being first on the advisory board for NAMI Greater Houston. And for the last 2 years, I've served on the actual board of directors for NAMI Greater Houston. My story is that I went from homeless, eating out of trash cans and sleeping on cardboard boxes in Fifth Ward here in Houston, Texas. Went from that to producing albums that have won Grammy Awards and Dove and Stellar Awards and having #1 records around the world and creating projects with my music and with my record label, The Bridge Life, that have raised now millions of dollars for causes around the world that I believe in. Being able to use my position and my platform to create systemic change and to bring about restoration in relationships. That's something that I take great pride in, something I am absolutely grateful for. Kristen, it is a pleasure to meet you. Shout out to everybody in Tomball and also to In Our Own Voice. It's good to meet you. Anybody else, as you tune in, feel free to comment below who you are, where you're from, so I can interact with you as well. The heart behind today's talk, I want to share with you guys, if I may. Want to talk specifically about the impact as it relates to dealing with anxiety and depression in the minority community specifically. Thank you, Kristen. In the minority community specifically since the death of George Floyd. Let me share something with you guys that I shared on Instagram, and I've talked a little bit about it, but I didn't want to supersede the greater issue. I actually knew George Floyd. I didn't know him well. We weren't close friends or anything like that. I want to be clear. But part of my capacity over the last 7 years in the churches in which I've served was outreach. And what that means is if you're in outreach, you're part of the team that goes into the local community, and you give out goods and clothing and things like that to inner city communities that need it. At Thanksgiving, you're taking turkeys and providing Thanksgiving dinner to families. At Christmas, you're giving out gifts to children who may not have a Christmas if you weren't the one bringing gifts out to them. Valentine's Day and Mother's Day, we would take roses and give roses out to single mothers in the inner city communities. And it was in that capacity of outreach that I had the opportunity to meet George Floyd. If you've ever served in outreach, especially in the inner city black communities, you know that every community has a gatekeeper. They call them an OG. And that means that that person is the one that vouches for you if you're an outsider coming into their community, because it can be dangerous for people to come in. If they don't know you, it can be dangerous for you to go into inner city communities trying to give them something or trying to do something there. You need the blessing of someone that, think of it in a positive sense, think of it like an elder in the community. Well, in CUNY Homes, where he's from, Big George Floyd was one of the OGs. He was one of the elders that you had to get his blessing in order to come into the community, CUNY Homes in particular, where he was from and where he held sway. So during some of the outreaches that I served in that community, I got to serve alongside George Floyd and see him help with baptisms and see him help with distributing the goods and the food and clothing and things like that went out to the community that we might be in at that time. I got to hear him tell young men how he made all kind of mistakes, some of which you've seen on the news over the last few months, because unfortunately the news media excoriated him after he was murdered. You know, the media has a way of bringing up all the negative things that you've done in your past, and they're legitimate things that you've done, but they're your past. That happened to him. I got to hear him share with young men how he made those mistakes and he did not want to see them go down the same road. If you actually know, he left to go to Minneapolis to get away from the forces that he felt kept pulling him back into negativity after he had already atoned for the poor decisions and mistakes he'd made here in Houston. And so I was, like everyone else, I saw on the day that he passed away, the 8 minutes and 46 seconds that the officer knelt on his neck, and that he was, the time when he passed away, if you watch it, you saw when his spirit left. You saw him pass away, and the world was tremendously affected by that. But I was especially affected by it because he was somebody that I had met. He was somebody that I knew, someone that I had had the opportunity to serve alongside. And let me speak from a black man perspective. It is already bad enough if you know that life is dangerous in a general sense. But speaking of anxiety, speaking of depression, speaking of mental health, it is even more so a struggle for you to process mentally when it seemed at that moment as if that could have happened to anyone. I'm a son. I have a father. I have a father-in-law, my wife's dad. I have brothers. My wife has a brother. My sister has a son. You know, I'm connected to black men all around me, and the fear in the black community, I want to speak from that perspective as we're talking about this, in that moment was that could happen to anyone, and that no one was safe. If I don't fight back, I can still be killed. If I don't resist arrest, I can still be killed. If I'm committing a crime, I can be killed. If I'm not committing a crime, I can be killed. If I'm doing something that's nonviolent but it's wrong, I could be killed. And so that brings about a whole nother level of anxiety, of depression, of frustration. And if my wife was on this Facebook Live, she would tell you that for days after the murder of George Floyd, I couldn't get out of bed. Now, mind you, we were already in the midst of the pandemic. My business, I'm a record producer, and we've got a studio here in Houston, and we were deemed a non-essential business. So during the time of the pandemic, when they initially shut down everything that was non-essential, for 3 months, I couldn't get up and go to work doing what I do every day. I couldn't go and create music. I couldn't work with our clients. I couldn't do any of the things that helped me to stay busy when all of the negativity was going on around us. So now you're at home. It's not safe to go anywhere because everywhere you turn, the news is saying that there was a virus on the bags at the grocery store, and there's a virus that gets on your clothes. And at one point they were saying it was airborne. Now they're saying that again. You know, you didn't know what was safe and what wasn't. And then we saw in quick succession Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery being shot down in Georgia, and then George Floyd. I read a study earlier today, and I'll share it in the comments when this is over with, that said that for minorities that were polled as a result of this after the death of George Floyd, whereas before, the number of minorities that were reporting that they dealt with extreme levels of anxiety and depression, they estimated that there were 36% of all of those polled who said that they were dealing with elevated levels of anxiety and depression. After the death of George Floyd, when those same people were polled again, they reported that 45% of those people, almost a 10% jump, were reporting elevated or extreme levels of anxiety and depression as a result of what they saw after the death of George Floyd. I see the question here. It seems as if we are hearing about more people, especially black men and teens, completing suicide. To what do I attribute this? To two factors. One, the hopelessness of loneliness. Don't discount the power of community. And if we're in a time right now where most people, if you weren't quarantined with your family during the period of time where you were not allowed to go anywhere, where it was a stay-at-home order, or if you're in a place like California watching this where there's still a stay-at-home order issued in parts of California, you could not go to be around your family, and technology only would carry you so far. So part of that is people who were only able to make it through the depths of their depression, through the depths of their anxiety, through the worst parts of whatever mental health challenge they might have been facing because of their friends and their family, that now are having to quarantine in isolation, and the isolation becomes unbearable. So I think that's one. And number two, and I know this may sound controversial, but I'll speak from my perspective, my opinion of it. I believe that part of it is that we live in a society where at least half of our society is openly communicating things that seem as though, for young black men, your life doesn't matter. And so if you live in a country where, or live in a society where you feel as though your life does not have adequate or equivalent value, you're seeing young men, young teens, to the question, saying, you know what, this isn't worth being here. I'd rather just not be here. And so they're taking their lives. I think that it's the isolation, the quarantine. Yeah, I think it's the people losing their jobs because businesses are shut down and they don't know how they're going to be able to provide, and they're giving up. I think that's part of it. I've been there. I understand. Hello, Nicole. I think that's part of it. And I think the other part of it is the racial divide, the societal racism is a poison. I used the reference on the Instagram live a little bit ago because you guys saw my post about going to the dentist earlier today and having them do work. Racism is an abscess below the surface that isn't causing you any pain until you poke at it. I went into that dentist office today and he showed me things in my mouth that I would not have ever imagined were there, that were the result of deep-seated, long-term effects and damage that had been done to me when I was homeless, during the time that I was homeless 20 years ago. That work now has to be fixed, but for him to do it, he had to poke and prod in areas in my mouth that I have not had a reason to. Brushing and flossing didn't reach those areas. It was below the surface. Racism exists in our country. It always has. Below the surface. It's systemic. Now, it can be above the board too, and some of you guys are seeing that on social media. Some of you guys have encountered that, as I have, in everyday life. But it's always existed below the surface too, and things like the death of George Floyd, things like the death of Elijah McClain and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and all the other countless names I could name, cause us to have to poke at those things. And what's happening is right now we're in a time where there's more poking happening than I think most of us that are alive now are accustomed to, unless you're older and you remember the 1960s when the Civil Rights Act was passed and the Voting Rights Act was passed, and Dr. Martin Luther King and Representative John Lewis, God rest his soul, who just passed away, when they were marching in Selma across the bridge, the Edward Pettus Bridge. When those times were happening, we were poking at it. But then there was a period of time where we allowed it to just settle below the surface. It came out every now and again, but for the most part, it was deeply embedded. And now in our society, due to people demanding change, due to the protests, due to the laws that are being advocated for and successfully being changed, we're poking at it again. And anytime you poke at that, it's going to expose the things that are below the surface. So as we're talking about how mental health is impacted now in the midst of what we're facing, I would give you guys a couple of pointers that have helped me to better navigate anxiety and depression during this time. I mentioned earlier, the first few days, Great question. Do you consider your homelessness a traumatic event or trigger for anxiety and depression? Yes, absolutely. For me, I was not a person who dealt with anxiety or depression my whole life. I've got friends of mine, and as a record producer, I have young artists that I'm blessed to produce, that they've always dealt with anxiety, or that they've always dealt with depression, or they've always dealt with bipolar disorder, or some mental health challenge. For me, I never faced that until I was homeless, having to eat out of a trash can. I never faced it until I watched my teeth rot out of my mouth and fall out. I love to smile, and having to go through that was traumatic for me. I never encountered anxiety or depression until I had to sleep under bridges and find cardboard boxes that weren't wet to sleep on, so that I wasn't sleeping on the cold concrete outside where I had to sleep in Fifth Ward. I had never encountered it in that degree, to that degree, until I was faced with that circumstance. So for me, yes, homelessness was absolutely a traumatic event and a trigger for anxiety and depression. So one of the things that I would say to you guys, I want to list 4 different things out that I think will help you if you are like me and you were battling with any form of anxiety or depression, or the weight that this time that we find ourselves in was causing you to carry. Number one of the most important things that my wife and I had to do early on, after maybe about 3 or 4 weeks of being in quarantine, watching the news all day, every day, and then George Floyd dying, was we had to stop watching the news all the time. We had to turn off the news. Let me say this. It's important to stay informed. It's important to know what's going on in the world around you. You can't function if you don't know what's happening. You don't know how bad the virus is. You might take risks that you wouldn't have otherwise taken. If you don't know how dangerous the societal issues are, you might find yourselves in a bad position that you didn't know about because you weren't informed. You got to be aware of what's going on in the news. But 24/7 news coverage right now is going to be traumatic to anyone. That's going to be a trigger or a traumatic event to the question that was asked to anyone. What we did, my wife and I, we set a certain amount of time. Usually it's every day. Like, I couldn't go to my office, but she could. So what we would do is, during the day, we would not watch the news. We would go about whatever our day was in the middle of being locked in at home or whatever. In the evening, we would watch the evening news so that we could understand what was going on around us, and then we turn it off. I had, as much as I'm on social media, I had to do the same thing with social media at one point in time as well. I had to say, okay, anything related to George Floyd or people being killed, or even how bad the virus is, I had to intentionally say, if I see it, I'm going to scroll past it. And if it's everywhere, if my feed is inundated, I'm going to log out and go play a video game, or go do something else, write my book, or do something that I can do that's productive, that allows me to focus on something that is healing. And a video game may not be healing, but it's also not adding additional stress to me. So that's what we had to do. Question number 3, do you believe that people of color carry generational trauma? What does that mean to you? And how does that factor into the way these communities deal with mental health? Brilliant question. I say absolutely they do. We do. People of color do carry generational trauma. If you guys follow me on social media, you saw me sharing maybe a month ago about the spate of hangings that was happening across the country. Now it's up to 8 people, including a young lady that was just found hung in her garage, and she had roommates and other people that were around, and nobody saw her body for 3 days. Anytime you go through these things as a culture, that the conversations surrounding that are passed down from grandparent to child. I've heard the stories growing up. My parents are my mom and my dad both were born and raised in the Delta, Mississippi. If you guys don't know what that is, go watch the movie Mississippi Burning. Some of the stories, Emmett Till and all these different things that you've heard talked about. My parents grew up in the middle of that reality in the 50s and the 60s, right before the civil rights moment, and during that when it was really bad. My parents were born and raised in Jim Crow. Segregated bathrooms, colored water fountains. You had to walk around the back. You couldn't walk in the same entrance. You better not get on that bus seat. Like, they grew up in that time. The stories from what they encountered were absolutely passed down to us. And while they serve to allow us to be informed about what was going on, they also bring about a measure of trauma, because I'm thinking about all of the people that my grandfather was blessed that he made it through those times. But there's a fear that you carry that if you do or say the wrong thing, that especially as a child, before you're able to defend yourself and before you understand the nature of the world around us, there is a fear that what happened to an Emmett Till could happen to me. For a long time when I was a kid, and I can admit it now because I'm grown and I know better, but when I was a kid, because I remember my grandfather and people of that age talking about how when they were grown men, they couldn't look a young white man in the eye. And they had, and even if they were 60 or 70 years old, they could be called boy, but they would have to call a 19, 20, 15-year-old young white man, they would have to call him sir. So I remember as a child, when I would meet older white men, I wouldn't look them in their eye. And I remember my dad saying, when you're a man and a man speaks to you, you look him in the eye when he's talking to you. Something as simple as that, because of the stories and the trauma that those stories carry of how those situations could have gone badly if I'd done that in the 1940s, 50s, or 60s. So yes, I do believe that people of color carry generational trauma. I believe that beyond just generational trauma in the space of mental health, I believe that the aspects of systemic racism that still permeate our society, even though a lot of people may not want to talk about it. My parents were blessed in that my father's retired military. They were able to buy a home. They were able to partake in home ownership. But generations before my father were not able to. Because of redlining, they weren't able to have homes in certain places, because of the laws that were authorized by the federal government that said that houses that were built in a certain time frame could not ever be deeded to an African American. There's a generation before mine that was cut off from being able to build the generational wealth that came from home ownership and from entrepreneurship. People found out again when President Trump had his rally in Tulsa. People heard, if you didn't already know, people heard about Black Wall Street. That kind of a thing carries generational trauma for Black people, because what that story tells us, and I'm saying story, but it's a very true story, that was a community there, Greenwood, that they built their own businesses, their own infrastructure. They had their own banks. They had their own transportation. They had built their own wealth structure. They were doing well. And simply because somebody became jealous of them, they were able to come in and murder people and burn their homes and their businesses to the ground, and chase them out. And that's Greenwood. Black Wall Street is not the only place that happens. Those stories are passed down through our generations, and they absolutely cause and carry generational trauma. How does that factor into the way that these communities deal with mental health? What it does is it causes Black people to not trust anyone that doesn't look like them. I'm blessed in that because my father was in the military, and because he and my mom raised us to not look at people differently. I'm blessed in that I didn't grow up with that stigma. But to most African Americans that grow up in a predominantly African American community, unlike me who grew up on a mixed military basis, to most minorities who grow up in a predominantly Black society, they don't trust anyone that doesn't look like them. Doesn't matter if you're a cop, doesn't matter what it is that you do. If you don't look like me, I don't trust you, period. And so if the therapist is not Black, they're not going to talk to them. If the school counselor who sees that these kids are dealing with challenges and wants to help them doesn't look like them, they're not going to open up and talk with them. So even in the Black church, mental health challenges, although they can be something that is tied to trauma, generational trauma, PTSD, based on things that we've gone through, they can also be tied to, obviously, as we know well in the mental health field, to chemical imbalances in our body, to chemistry, something that has no basis in spiritual matters at all. In the Black church, rather than address these things because of the generational trauma, we would rather just pray it away. That's why my first post said mental illness is not a sin, nor is it something that should be prayed away. That doesn't mean you can't pray for these things. That doesn't mean that you can't make your requests known to God, but it means that there is a natural component to these things that we over spiritualize. Part of that is because of the generational trauma that teaches us that science is wrong and that we can't trust anyone that doesn't look like us. So these things carry weight, that if we don't break the cycle, if we don't change the paradigm, our children are going to carry these things. One of the things I've been intentional about with my three daughters, they're 19, 13, and 8. My oldest daughter is a sophomore at Texas A&M. One of the things that I've been intentional, that my queen and I have been intentional, and their mother too, have been intentional on instilling in them, is that they need to be exposed to people that don't look like them. I've always brought my girls around all of my friends and had the opportunity for them to be exposed to people from different walks of life, so that they don't grow up with that mentality that you don't look like me, so I can't trust you. That comes from generational trauma, and it's one of those cycles that we have to break, because if we don't, our children are going to be fighting the same battles. So I mentioned that I wanted to share 4 things with you guys, if I can, that will help you to navigate this time. If you are being inundated by all of the news media and all the fighting over what's a legitimate organization and what's not, and what do we know about the COVID, and now they're arguing about whether the doctor is legitimate that's saying there's a cure or not. No matter where you stand on that, if you're dealing with anxiety, depression, carrying a burden, a weight as a result of that, number one, tone back on your news media coverage. Make sure that you don't spend as much time in the news media. Number 2, find reputable sources. If the news media coverage that you're going to watch or to listen to or to read, if they agree with you on everything that you believe, they're probably biased, because all of us carry some type of bias. If we only listen to sources that feed into that bias, we're setting ourselves up for more anxiety when we inevitably run into people on the other side who believe the opposite of what we believe. We're going to all have to face different perspectives. Some of the greatest knowledge that I've ever gained in my life was from people who didn't look like me and didn't believe the same thing that I believe, because they challenged me to step outside of the box of my own perception. So don't only listen to or watch people who believe what you believe. Be careful of only tuning in to biased media sources. Number 3, make sure you're getting adequate rest. I know this seems overly simple, but if you look at our lives since the quarantine hit, since the pandemic hit, if you're like me, for a long time before our studio reopened about a month ago, I was going to sleep at whatever time of the day, might fall asleep at 2 in the afternoon, wake up at 5 in the afternoon, go back to sleep at 3 in the morning, wake up at 11 o'clock the next day. I didn't know whether I was going or coming. Many of you guys can relate to that too, because I saw the posts on social media about it. Most of us, if you were not able to go to your job, some of you may not be able to work right now, and you're at home, some of the stress you feel is because you are turning your body into something that it should not be, because you're not going with your natural rhythm. Make sure that you are intentional on turning that phone off at a certain time of the night, turning the TV off at a certain time of the night. If you drink caffeine, don't drink it before a certain hour, so that you're able to tune out, get you some rest, get on a regular cycle, let your body regulate itself. What are you eating? What are you putting into your temple? Make sure that you are being intentional on eating, drinking things that are healthy for you. Make sure that you're getting good rest, because all of those things can play a factor in your mental health as well. And the last thing that I would say as it relates to that is use the energy that you feel. Jennifer, thank you, dear. Love you. Thank you. Use the energy that you feel to channel it into doing something good. For me, knowing George Floyd personally and seeing him die the way that he died, I carried an extra weight at the beginning of the first few weeks after he passed away, because I felt like I have a platform that reaches millions of people around the world. When I do songs, they sell millions of copies, whether it's for me or that I produce for other people. When I'm speaking and doing things that are going viral and 50 and 60 and 100,000 views and stuff like that, if I have that platform and I was not using it for causes that I believe in, my wife and I, we would march. And I've written songs about, the civil rights moment that we find ourselves in before, and, the police brutality and those kind of things. I've done that before, but I didn't use my platform the way that I felt that I could have. So I felt guilty about that. But the best thing that I've been able to do as it relates to finding a solve was to channel that anxiety, that depression, that frustration, even the guilt, into using my voice in a way that it can affect change. If you feel strongly about what's going on right now, whether it's through anxiety or depression or anger or bitterness or whatever you might be feeling, channel that energy into doing something that makes a difference. If you follow me on social media, since the day George Floyd died, I've been intentional on talking about these causes and being open about what I've seen and sharing news media reports from both sides, positive and negative, things that are uplifting and things that poke away at the abscess beneath the surface, so that people can see the ugliness of racism that still lies in the hearts of many men. I've been intentional on using my platform because my heart is, rather than dwell in anxiety and depression, I want to use my voice to bring about change that might keep the next George Floyd from being killed, that might keep the next Elijah McClain alive, might save the next Breonna Taylor. If I can touch one heart with what I feel and what I believe, then it's worth the anxiety and the depression, because I'm choosing not to dwell in that place, but to use it as a funnel to pour out what I believe and the energy behind that to inspire other people. So I would leave you with that. No matter where you stand on these issues, you know, if you are a person like me that believes that equality and liberty and justice should be had by all, regardless of any organizational thing, the great Dr. Tony Evans said the other day as it related to the organization Black Lives Matter. He said that people have a legitimate, in some cases, gripe as it relates to the legitimacy of the organization because of the founding of that organization. He said, but while we may be able to have a legitimate disagreement about methodology, we should never have a legitimate disagreement about whether our lives matter. If you're like me and you believe that all lives matter, but that Black lives are in danger right now, regardless of the methodology, use your voice to speak. Use the anger, use the anxiety, if you're battling with depression and it's based in these issues, use what platform God has given you to be a light and to encourage other people, to give hope to other people. If you are a person that channels your energy in that way, you won't have to worry about carrying anxiety or depression, because instead of that, you're going to filter it through your experiences and through your heart and through your words into something that gives light and hope to other people. And that's not going to allow you to dwell in a negative place. So I'm grateful for you guys. I'm going to do one more special thing for you guys before the day is over. Jessica, I may go a little bit after 6 because I've got to get to the recording studio, but I'm going to do something special for you guys today on the NAMI pages. Thank you for tuning in for the takeover. And if you have any other questions, definitely send them to NAMI Greater Houston. I'll try to answer you, even if I have to DM you after this is over with. I've enjoyed this time with you. Blessings to each and every one of you. And matter of fact, let me pray with you guys if I can. Dear Heavenly Father, in the name of Jesus, God, I thank you for this platform. I thank you for NAMI, both our NAMI Greater Houston chapter and all of the NAMIs across the country, God. I thank you for the heart to remove stigma as it relates to mental illness. God, I thank you for the times in which we find ourselves, because it's always in the most trying times that you are able to show yourself most mighty. The Bible says when the enemy comes in like a flood, you will raise up a standard against him, God. And right now we're dealing with a flood of misinformation on social media. We're dealing with the flood of COVID-19 that seeks to overcome our hospitals and overcome our elderly and inundate us not only with sickness, but even with fear. And God, we are inundated, we are overcome, or the enemy wants to overcome us with a flood of hatred and division and racism. But God, we believe that you're going to raise up the standard of unity. You're going to raise up a standard of justice and equality that will cause people, no matter what they believe, to find common ground at the cross, where all are equal because we're all covered by your blood. Thank you for this platform. Thank you for the opportunity to share. Thank you for the hearts of the people who tuned in and those who will see this in perpetuity. God, let this be something that, instead of causing division, brings us together. This is my prayer, and I believe it to be done, for I ask it in Jesus' name. And everybody said, amen. I love you guys. Thank y'all for tuning in. Appreciate y'all.